I'm John Carr, and I'm here with Dr. Enid Gort, and together we're going to try to explain how a documentary became a book, which became an article for the New York Archives magazine. And common thread of all these is archived. The central figure of this story is Ambassador Franklin Williams, a hidden figure in the civil rights movement, who I unfortunately never met. But Dr. Gort knew him well, and I'm going to ask Enid to give the Reader's Digest version of how she happened to meet and go to work for this extraordinary character. Enid, can you tell us how you and Franklin met and how he offered you a job?
I certainly can. It's an unforgettable incident in my life. I did 3 years of field work in Swaziland. And when I returned, my husband made a small dinner party for me at a restaurant in New York City. And he invited someone I didn't know, amongst all those that I did know, a man named Gil Jonas, who had been in the Foreign Service and had served in Africa, and also was the fundraiser for the NAACP. And he thought Gil would be an interesting person to be at the little get together. And indeed he was. And I spent a lot of time talking to Gil. This, I think, was only the second night that I was home after having been away for so long. And so I had a lot to say, and Gil was somebody I could speak to. After the party, I came home and I went to sleep. And I was awakened around 7:30 in the morning by somebody who announced himself as Ambassador Franklin Paul Donald Lowry Williams. And he said, I'd like me. First, he said, are you sleeping? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, well, I don't know why you'd be sleeping at this late hour. Why don't you get dressed and come over here for breakfast? And I didn't know where the here was. And he said, I didn't know who he was. And he said, I'm right around the corner from you. I'm on East 87th Street, and you can be over here in 15 minutes. And at first I thought this was a prank call and I was going to hang up and go back to sleep. And then I thought there was something about the call and the caller that made me feel there might be something to it. So I did what he said. I jumped out of bed, got dressed, ran over, and entered this very beautiful brownstone. And I noticed that it said the Phelps Stokes Fund on a plaque on the wall. So I went in and I got into an elevator and it took me to the second floor, and I met Ambassador Williams. And I had no idea what he was going to say. And so I said, so he said, I would like to offer you a job. And I said, well, thank you, but I'm not looking for a job. I have a dissertation to write. I'm a student at Columbia University. And he said, oh, well, never mind that. He said, we'll find a job for you here and we'll pay you and you'll do work. And I know that you can do the work or whatever we suggest that you do, because I spoke to Gil Jonas this morning. Apparently, Gil had called him and told him about me. So I said, but I don't want a job. And he said, I'll tell you what, you go home and you think about my offer. And so I did. I told my husband about it, and he said, don't be so fast to turn it down. There are things in that offer that you will appreciate. Number one, that's the kind of work you want to do, working for an organization that's concerned with enhancing educational opportunities for Africans, African Americans, and Native Americans. It sounds like something you'd be interested in. So why don't you see if you could talk to him further and see if you could make something that would work for you. So I went back and he said, you know what? He said, don't worry about time. I will give you a key to this building and you can come and go as you like. So you could spend time at Columbia and you could spend time at here. And that's what happened. And I wound up doing so much work at Phelps Stokes Fund because it was such a fun place and it was such a dramatic place and a dynamic place. And the work that was being done there was work that I indeed wanted to do. So that's how it met.
Now, I come to it all from a different angle. I work for the state court system, and I helped the Franklin Williams Judicial Commission, the first court-based commission in the nation committed to racial and ethnic fairness in the courts, produce a documentary that's aired on PBS stations across the country and was nominated for an Emmy. In researching that, I met Enid, and that resulted in our book, A Bridge to Justice, and that resulted into our article. But as I mentioned at the start, archives played a central role from the beginning. And Enid, can you just give me a real quick rundown of the type of archival materials you used and a quick synopsis of how you actually archived archives for the Schomburg?
Well, I first should say that I worked for the Phelps Stokes Fund and for Franklin Williams for about 5.5 years. And then tragically, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. And it was during that time that he wanted me to be around him because he wanted to tell somebody his life story. And I agreed to talk to him and listen to him and formulate questions when I had them. And so I often went to the doctor with him and often sat with him when he was in his office resting from whatever chemotherapy he had. And he would talk and I would ask questions. And I wound up with 29 tapes, 60-minute tapes of Franklin Williams telling his life story. After that, and then after he died, I wrote and received a grant to interview people whose lives had impacted his, celebrities such as Rachel Robinson, the wife of Jackie Robinson, the widow of Jackie Robinson, and people like Frank Mankiewicz, who is probably known best now because his son is the MC on Turner Classic Movies, but he himself was very involved in the civil rights movement and in movies and in work in Washington. So I interviewed him. I interviewed Sergeant Shriver from the Peace Corps and many other people, and people who are not famous, but people who played large roles in the NAACP. So I have about 100 tapes of those people. And then I thought, well, I have all this material. I think I should write a book. And so I started to look around to find out where are materials that I could be reading or looking at that might tell me more about the period of time when Franklin was at the NAACP and the period of time when he was an ambassador. So the first place I visited was the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, and I worked on the archives that were the NAACP West Coast archives. And then I went to Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., where I accessed the archives of the NAACP in Washington. I also used the Columbia University archives because they had some information on Franklin when he was head of the Urban Center of Columbia University. So those were the archives I used in addition to the archives at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Now, those archives, those materials were given to that institution by Franklin Williams while he was dying, and I was the one who went through those materials and actually physically took them up to the Schomburg. So when it came time to archiving them, I found out a lot about libraries that they don't always have the money to archive collections, and I was worried that Franklin's materials would sit on a shelf like many other people's did up there. And so I hired a woman named Kathy Hajo, who was a student in the archival program at NYU. And she and I together archived the materials that are at the Schomburg now. So these materials that I have in my possession, which are going to the archives at the Schomburg, will join that collection.
That's great. So we have, so you used archives at the Smithsonian, you used archives in Washington, you used archives at the University of California at Berkeley, and you created archives. In addition, we used archives at the New York State Archives, which contains the original report that Franklin Williams helped put together on racial and ethnic bias in the courts. And one more thing on archives, I come to this as a recovering journalist, and for me, public records are archives. And it occurred to me that perhaps a civil rights attorney in the 1940s and 1950s may have attracted the attention of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, and he surely did. And I had used the Freedom of Information Act to obtain whatever records they had, and we got 186 pages back. So it's a real pleasure and honor to be able to write for the New York Archives magazine. It's a fabulous publication. And since there are so many links to archives in this story, in the documentary, in the book, in the article, it just seems like a perfect place for our article. So I'd like to thank the New York Archives Trust for making this possible for us.